Hello, everyone. Yesterday, the United Nations led conversation that was hopefully going to save the world from the plastic problem failed or collapsed. Now, what was this whole talk about? Why did it fail? What does this mean to you and I? And how bad is this plastic problem? Stick around for the next few minutes. I'll see what I can do about that. Now, yesterday, the 1st of December 2024, the 1 week long INC5, that's Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee of the United Nations, that was looking to find a lasting solution to the plastic problem, failed to arrive at any decision. Now, in March 2022, about 175 countries came together and realized that if nothing is done about the plastic problem, we would soon see ourselves drowning in plastics. And so they have agreed that by the end of 2024, we should have a legally binding treaty. And by that, we mean a sort of agreement amongst countries that ensures that enforceable actions, laws are put in place to reduce the plastic problem. And what was happening in the last 1 week, which ended on Sunday, the 1st of December, was the treaty or the conversation that was meant to lead to that legally binding treaty. Unfortunately, that did not work. It broke down. The conversations broke down. This was attended by about 200 countries, and they couldn't reach a conclusion. Now, the main sticking points were, number one, putting a cap on plastic production. Number two, the next second problem was agreeing on some form of finance, just something similar to the climate finance, so that they can support developing countries, the harder hit countries, to help reduce the problem of plastics. And the third one was agreeing on how to regulate the chemicals that are added to plastics during manufacture. Now, I'll touch each and every one of these points one after the other. So the first point being putting a cap on plastic production. The talks was meant to reach a point where the countries agree that we need to cut down plastic production to a certain number because of a lot of problems, which I'm also going to go into. But that conversation could not come to any significant conclusion. And that's a very important part of the conversation, because we can bang on all we like about, recycling and all the other things we want to keep talking about. But if we do not do something about the source of the plastics that is coming in, I doubt that we're going to get any significant results. The second point being the finance issue. Some of the hardest hit countries, so Nigeria, Ghana, you would see heaps of plastic waste. And that's quite understandable, because in developed countries, you use your gadgets, your phone, your television, your computers, washing machines, microwaves for a couple of years, and then you ship them to maybe give them to charity or something, or dash them out. And oftentimes this then end up with most of their life spent in places like Ghana, Nigeria, where there's no strong laws to restrict how these things are recycled. And so you have individuals burning these plastics, releasing toxic fumes into the environment, causing serious harm. And you might think, okay, well, it's happening far away in Africa, but that's not the thing, because when these plastics are broken down, there's a heavy rainfall. It gets washed into surrounding rivers and ends up in oceans. And as you know, these oceans are boundless. And so it ends up somewhere in the UK or in Bahamas or somewhere, just get washed up. And so what goes around comes around. So there's no separating ourselves from the problem. So these countries where the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you would see that people are not so bothered about plastics. People are thinking about survival. People are thinking about their health. People are thinking about food. So they're not so bothered about, talks about plastic. In places like the UK and some European countries now, there are restrictions and all of those things that are happening to restrict the use of plastic. In some of these countries, these things do not happen. And because these problems would eventually come back to us, we in the developed countries need to support developing countries and developing economies to do something about plastic. So whatever you think about that, that's what has to happen. Now, chemicals that are added to plastics during manufacture. For plastics to get the features that make them plastics, ability to mold them, to melt and mold them into different shapes, the color we add to them and all of those things, we add chemicals like plasticizers, flame retardants to reduce how fast they burn. Those chemicals have been tested in laboratories, and we know a good number of them are toxic. A good number of them are carcinogenic. That means they cause cancer. And so there might not be a clear link between how these chemicals from the plastics are released into the environment, but there are clear scientific research that has linked health conditions to plastic. For instance, one of the videos I did last week, I talked about a research that has found a link between nanoplastics and antimicrobial resistance. And by nanoplastics, so whether we say nanoplastics or microplastics, it's just about size. It's big plastic breaking down into smaller sizes. We call them microplastics. Smaller sizes, we call them nanoplastics. Now, so there's been link between plastics and health conditions. There's been a link between the microplastics that were found in very strange parts of the human body, in scrotum, can you imagine, in human testicles, in lungs, breast milk, blood, brain, almost everywhere plastics have been found, and this to an extent has been linked to health conditions. I saw a research where one of the longest stretch of river, it was found that 4 in 5 fish had plastics in them. So it ends up on our table. So it's a big problem. And these chemicals, we need to find a way of restricting or regulating the kind of chemicals that are added to plastics. And then, putting all of this together, this conversation could not come to an agreement on what to do about these issues. The major problems were petroleum producing countries, because I'm sure you're aware that plastics actually are made from petroleum products. And so countries like Saudi, Saudi's name came up a number of times. So oil producing countries were quite strong. These guys have money. They can push lobbyists to ensure that these conversations do not lead to a cap or a reduction in the products that they sell. And so there were a lot of accusations of people being cut out of conversations, some private conversations, not allowing certain people to go in. And I kind of understand all of those things. And in the spirit of fairness, let's analyze some of the conversations, some of the points that these oil producing countries are raising. So for them, they've argued that we should focus on encouraging recycling and, cleaning up the waste than we should on trying to reduce how much of it comes into the environment. But that argument is, I don't want to be rude, but that argument is a very silly argument. And let me just put that in perspective. So currently, the annual production of plastic is around 400 million tons per annum. Now, to put that in perspective, one SUV, an average SUV, would weigh between 3,500 to 6,000 pounds. If we take the maximum, which is 6,000 pounds, we are looking at about 133 million SUVs of plastic waste. That's what we produce annually. Now, that is expected to increase by 70% in 2040. So whatever problem we think we're dealing with now, in 2040, looking at the trajectory, we would be looking at 70% increase in 133 million SUVs of plastic waste. So the argument that we can just start cleaning it up and not do anything about what is coming in, you can see why I say it's a bit silly. Let's put that logic in perspective. So imagine that you have a waste bin in your house. and you've got some waste in it at the minute, which is the plastic we're talking about. What we recycle currently is less than 10% of the plastic that we generate or that we manufacture. So what that simply means is if you have that bin and you divide it into 10 equal parts filled with waste, what we are currently getting rid of is less than 1 part of the 10 parts. And so the idea that you would be able to stop the inevitable future of this waste being filled up by simply reducing less than 10% of it is illogical. You need to find a way of reducing what is coming in as you're trying to reduce what is going on. And even if following these conversations we succeed in increasing the percentage that we recycle from less than 10% to say 50%, you still have 50% of that waste accumulating, and you still have that going to grow in the nearest future. So that argument wouldn't stand. And we kind of understand where they're coming from because, for them, it's profit. But if you put your sustainability hats on, you would realize that it doesn't take a PhD or any form of expertise to understand that if we continue on this path, we are only going to have continuous accumulation of the problem. And I kind of understand where some of the complications that these people analyze is coming from. You see, there's this thing I do every time I teach a module on plastics. I tell students to try to go through your whole day, and every time you come into contact with plastic, stop yourself at that point. And to be honest, in most times that I've tried that thing, I've not succeeded in getting people out of their beds because your bed in the first place is made up of plastic. Not to talk of your toothbrush, not to talk of your cloth you wear, the carpet you step on, and all the sofa you're going to sit on, the computer, the phone, and everything is plastic. So I understand that it's a bit difficult for us to say we want to stop the use of plastic. But the other side of that conversation is we need to start moving in a certain direction. That movement will be further strengthened by making it more difficult for us to keep using the cheap and the dangerous toxic products that we're currently using. So putting in some restrictions would start giving life or leverage to people who are trying to make non-plastic products. Prices will start coming down and people will start moving in that direction. So that's one way to look at it. Now, looking at chemicals, which is another very dicey part of the conversations. By experience, every time you try to restrict use of chemicals, alternative chemicals that are oftentimes more toxic than what you're trying to restrict comes into play. And so the argument would be, why restrict if it's not going to work? But the question then becomes, if you do not restrict, what will be the incentive for people to try to move towards getting products or chemicals or alternative products that would replace what we all know is a problem? So, there you have it. The treaty could not hold because some people who obviously profit from the continuous production of plastics wouldn't agree for some decisions to be taken. And you and I have a responsibility, if we would leave a planet fit to live in for our children and our children's children, to keep this conversation going, do our little bits by not using plastics where we can have alternatives, and also getting this conversation going so that we keep putting pressure on our governments so that they arrive at a point where they're able to take these simple decisions that are important not just for us, but for our children's children. Now, like I've said, if you think it's not going to affect you, then you must be living in la la la. The life expectancy of humans would continue to be impacted by these chemicals that are being loaded into our body. Cancer is becoming an everyday thing now, where it's difficult for you to not know somebody or not know somebody who knows somebody who is either suffering from a form of cancer or who has died from a form of cancer. So these things are around us, and we need to all do what we can to help the situation. One thing you can do is to like and share this video. Keep the word active, and hopefully we'll keep our world better. Thank you for watching, and see you again soon.